without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker today. Emily Talon is a professor in the Division of Social Science, and she is the director of the Urbanism Lab at the University of Chicago. Her research has been devoted to urban design and urbanism, especially the relationship between the built environment and social equity. She received her PhD from the University of Santa Barbara, a much less urban setting than what we have here in Chicago, but I'm sure she won't hold that against us. So without further ado, let me introduce Emily Talon.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody, and thank you for coming out this morning. Oh my gosh, it's such a beautiful day, so I will try to be as entertaining as I can be. I'm going to talk a little bit about this Chicago neighborhood project that we've been up to at the University of Chicago. We got some funding to basically crowdsource where are Chicago neighborhoods, and I'll talk a little bit about the background of that and where we're at with that project, and then I want to just talk a little bit about neighborhood as a concept a little more generally. So it's a crowdsource. Perhaps did anybody in here do the survey? Oh man, we didn't reach you guys. You don't know it. Okay, well it's closed now. It just closed. I'm sorry to say, but so we did hire a marketing firm who we were on Google Ads, and we did all kinds of effort, outreach. We did not do CTA ads because those turned out to be very expensive. We did a lot of email outreach. We tried to get all the older people to push it to their wards. We contacted like 300 community organizations. So we tried our very best. We were on social media quite a bit. We had media coverage with Block Club Chicago and Chicago Magazine, and we were on TV, and somehow we didn't make it up here. But anyway, we tried hard to get as many people as possible to weigh in. The New York Times did something very similar with where's your New York neighborhood, and they got 35,000 responses. We got about 5,500, which actually, if you do the math, it's not that bad. We're kind of proud of it, actually, and this is just a dump of everybody's drawn neighborhood, so you can't make any sense of this, but this is just to kind of give you a sense of what we had. This map looked much worse after about a month in. It was all on the north side where people were, I don't know, getting news about, I guess, through social media, and they were drawing neighborhoods. So we hired a separate survey lab out of the University of Chicago to have students go into places on the south and west side, churches, community organizations, with iPads and say, hey, could you please draw your neighborhood? What do you think is your neighborhood? So we did a little bit better there. So some of our research questions that were, why did we do this? It's a research project. We wanted to know how much consensus is there around neighborhood perception and identity. How big are these neighborhoods that people are thinking of in terms of population and in terms of geographic area? What do people leave out of their neighborhoods, and what are they including? How do they line up with the Chicago's semi-official neighborhoods that they have now, which was in place for decades, and the community areas, which are not actually neighborhoods, they're community areas? What's at the center of these neighborhoods that people are drawing? Is there a lot of social homogeneity around what they're drawing, or are they actually including something a little socially heterogeneous? What makes up the boundary? Are these oriented around particular uses like schools and libraries? So one of the things that I want to do as a researcher is look at, okay, we have all kinds of literature on theory about neighborhood, how big neighborhoods ideally should be, what they should be oriented around, what is at the center of the neighborhood, and kind of match that theoretical posturing about neighborhood that comes out of urban planning, line that up with what people's perceptions are. So that's kind of the research agenda. And this is just zooming in on Hyde Park. As of when this data was tapped, 188 respondents. And then this is the community areas in green there, and those are all the various boundaries that people drew. We've been spending a lot of time actually in the past month or so cleaning data. So we have garbage stuff in there, people just doing like the whole universe, and you could draw whatever you wanted on there. So we made some assumptions about things that we thought were not serious.
Is that big triangle in the lake a combinatory point?
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, I mean, we got a lot of. We had a website set up and an email where people could click and register comments. And I have one comment for you here. When I saw this article, I remember thinking, "Don't fuck with our communities, Buster." Sorry for the language, but. We had some people actually upset, like, what are you doing? I have my neighborhood. Do not change the community areas. And we had to tell them, hey, we're just researchers. We're not changing anything. That's up to the city. I mean, maybe it would be interesting someday for the city to revisit where neighborhoods are. I think that is not a bad idea at all. And let's just review where we are with all that. You guys know these 77 community areas, which were formed back in the 1920s. And maybe you guys already know the history of this. I know somebody in here does, but the Chicago School of Sociology, Ernest Burgess, and the brainchild here of this effort. And he and his colleagues, including Vivian Palmer, of course, who was a woman behind the scenes who did most of the work, they got together and they did this amazing effort of talking to they interviewed people, they created all these amazing maps. It's all online for you guys who might already know about this stuff. And they really tried so hard. They wanted, this was a new field, social science. So this was going to be the science of where are people living and grouping themselves, and how can we differentiate this patchwork of places in Chicago, and where might we create these community areas. They didn't have in mind neighborhoods. I was surprised to learn that neighborhoods were something else. They knew that. And there is a book actually written by Vivian Palmer talking about interviewing the individual neighborhoods within each community area. But the city adopted these community areas, and so they really stuck. They stuck until the Edgewater folks came along and said, we want our own community area, which you guys know that. But originally it was 400, it was 75 community areas, and they contemplated 400 neighborhoods out of that 75. And these are just some of you guys might have seen these online. It's so fascinating. They just mapped every ethnicity, but then things like juvenile delinquency and where is mental illness, and every social variable you can think of, they went out and tried to map it. And then they tried to, let's take all that information, and here's the Czechs, there's one for Dutch, there's one for lots of different groups, and it's a wonderful historical record that we have from them. But they took all that, and for being social scientists, they didn't really, I think in the end, the creation of the community areas wasn't really all that scientific, in that it was really Ernest Burgess sitting around the table and just kind of mapping out. Today we have much more sophisticated ways of dealing with spatial data and thinking about how to group things. But here's what he came up with. This is the original 75. before Edgewater was split off from Andersonville. Uptown, sorry, Uptown. You guys know this history better than I do. And then the other one that was added was O'Hare, because land was annexed by the city in 1956. And this separation, this creation of number 77 was in 1980. So this was the original that Burgess just kind of, I spent several days in the special collections at the University of Chicago where the Burgess papers are. And it is like boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff and maps that he did, the original maps that he did. And I was hoping to find something in there that would tell me how they actually derived these community areas. Like, what was the process? And I think it's not actually there. I think it's just more it's more fluid and more internalized to Burgess and Vivian Palmer, who worked with him. Okay, so neighborhoods, of course, are fashioned in other ways besides these community areas. A lot of times when I talk about neighborhoods in Chicago, people bring up the parishes, that these were the neighborhoods of Chicago. And there is a map of this is from, what is the date on this? 1926. A map of Chicago's Catholic churches, and the ethnic composition is in here too. I'm sorry, you can't read it very well. This is in the Newberry Library. So we have that kind of understanding of neighborhood. Chicago's block clubs, of course, those are neighborhoods, right? Those might be thought of as neighborhoods. And there's a wonderful book by this historian, Amanda Seligman, on the Chicago block clubs, the history of those. So, but what about in a more official capacity, the understanding of neighborhood in Chicago? I'm showing you a 1946 plan of Chicago that the city did. This was part of their comprehensive city plan. And you cannot see this, but if you would zoom in here, they actually do have neighborhoods that they identified, and there were 514 of them, according to this plan. And they're kind of like, they're really based on elementary schools. And that's been a concept of neighborhood for a very long time. And the neighborhood is around the school. And so that's what they did back then. They weren't, I mean, it's in the comprehensive plan, but there's no sort of official designation. Then in 1978, they designated 178 neighborhoods, the city did, and this was based on a resident survey, but it wasn't, I don't think it was a particularly robust survey. It was something like 10 people per community area or something like that. It was very low grade kind of survey work. But anyway, this is there. This is the 178 neighborhoods. And then later, the city adopted a neighborhood map of 228 neighborhoods. And apparently they were stealing the work of somebody else. Now, you know this guy who does this, Chris Devine is his name. Does anybody know him? He is a cool guy. I had him come speak to my class once, and he showed up with his neighborhood map and gave every student a neighborhood map. And he literally, he's just kind of this really interesting, extroverted person, and he went around and hung out in bars and, you know, talked to people on the street and really tried to understand their understanding of where their neighborhood was. So he got wind of the city sort of adopting his neighborhoods, and he set out to sue the city over that. I don't think that actually ever went anywhere, but he did try. Sorry, this is the last layer on there. Then, about 10 years ago, this crowdsourcing, where's your neighborhood idea was done. So we were not the first to do it. This was done by something called DNA Info. which is, I don't think they're still in existence. Okay, yeah, did it morph into something else?
Block Club Chicago.
Oh, really? Huh, okay. So Block Club Chicago is interviewing me about this project next week. So yeah, they did a crowdsource thing. They didn't, carry it very far. They did it a very short period of time. Other groups have been doing this, something called livelihoods, where they asked people where their neighborhoods were. No. This was based on check-in. Like on your cell phone when you check in. What is that? I'm way too old to understand this stuff. So they attempted to map neighborhoods by where people were checking in. And people have been now using cell phone data and other means to try to get at this understanding of neighborhood, which is, I find very interesting. And then there's this definition from 1957. A painful definition. And so we have all these different definitions of neighborhood, even to tailgating. There's a website, tailgating.com, the last great American neighborhood. How many of you know Jane Jacobs? Oh, a lot of it. It's such an enlightened crowd here. So she was this urban planner from 1961 who just changed the world in urban planning circles. And she already recognized in 1961 that our understanding of neighborhood was getting really weird, and it was becoming everything. And if it's everything, it's nothing. And she said neighborhood is a word that has come to sound like a Valentine. And what she meant was it doesn't mean anything. It's just kind of a geographic locator. It doesn't have the resonance that we hoped it would have. And I'm going to explain why it would have that, or why we hoped it would. So in Chicago, we have goofy things like completely gerrymandered wards. So you cannot relate the place around you to collective work and to having a political voice. And, on top of that, we have all kinds of other layers of representation. And I'm showing you here, this is the 5-minute walk, that circle around a school. Also in here are police precincts. There are census tracts. There are community areas. There are the neighborhood organization boundaries, which don't line up with those neighborhoods I showed before. So
Historical society boundaries.
Historical society boundaries. There's another one. So it's just layer upon layer of different conceptions and understandings of how to do something meaningful with the place around you. So I wrote a book, it's 4 years old already, called Neighborhood. And I argue in there that, okay, so if neighborhood is all these different things, well, what do we want it to be? And I tried to make an argument that here's what we want a neighborhood to be. Let's have a vision about what we want our neighborhood to be. Neighborhoods come in all shapes and sizes, but what might be a kind of common theme and common denominator is that they have these three things. First of all, they have identity. There's something that, there's a center, there's a park, there's something, I think you guys have that here. A lot of places around Chicago do not have that necessarily. It has a name. It has, people understand where it is and that they're in or out of it in some way. And so there's this sort of generally agreed on understanding of the neighborhood. It also, though, is connected. And it shouldn't be, and again, I'm talking about the aspiration here. It shouldn't be insular and all to itself. It needs to be connected externally and internally. And it has facilities and services, ideally, that you would need within the neighborhood. That would be the key for helping with that social connection part. And it's socially diverse, or at least it's open to allowing diversity to come in. Again, it's not shutting itself off. That's our hope, our dream for what a neighborhood should be. And finally, and probably most importantly, it has collective voice. It has some way for residents to get together and effectuate change and be able to act collectively, and for residents to be involved in its own affairs. Why do we need to do this? Why is this important to have an understanding of neighborhood like this? I think first of all, these qualities foster a sense of ownership and caring, that you care about the place around you. And I think that I would argue that that's less possible when neighborhood is ambiguous and it's a tailgating party and it's who knows what it is. It's whatever people want it to be. Without that kind of stronger identity, it's hard to do that. Secondly, and again, this is aspirational, neighborhoods have services, and those services are part of daily experience. And that is absolutely essential to the social connection piece of this. Thirdly, and maybe most importantly, it substitutes, if you have this clearer idea of neighborhood and where it is, and how you can be part of it and be part of the collective voice, it substitutes place for the identity of the neighborhood instead of homogeneity, which is often what social scientists do, and what Burgess was doing, looking for where is the homogeneity out there, and let's draw the boundaries accordingly. And that creates problems. That is not actually aspirationally what is a good way to plan a city. What you want is to foster diversity and support it, and so if you have this neighborhood that's place-based, that might substitute for this more social homogeneity kind of understanding of neighborhood. Just real quick about some of the, I mentioned that book. I went through a lot of history, and I way back history, like ancient history. Archaeologists are very much engaged in looking at where neighborhoods were in the archaeological record, and they find them all over. They talk about neighborhoods a lot. They talk about how neighborhoods were very much differentiated in ancient cities that they excavate, and that there was diversity within, because you have rich and poor living side by side, or below and on top. Here's just from one of the many studies I was able to find. This is a neighborhood in the Netherlands in the 17th century, which was tracing what were people paying for rent, and in this one neighborhood, and they were able to show that there was this incredible variation in rent levels within the neighborhood. So that was to the point of the diversity within a neighborhood. Of course, this is all before we were confronted with car-based cities. These were walking cities. Did this mean that people, rich and poor, were somehow friendly and got along, and that it was all, no. You kept your social position. You were living rich and poor side by side, and also in this case, all one, probably all white. You kept you were comfortable with that juxtaposition of rich and poor. The rich were okay with them because they knew where they stood in society. There were no questions about it, like through their dress, through the fact that they had, servants and things, so there wasn't this, as we do now, you need to establish social position by moving out to the right neighborhood. No, you could stay in that neighborhood, but there were these social mores kind of keeping it all together. But what was a good thing, a really good thing, is that rich and poor were sharing the same public realm. They were sharing the same streets. They were sharing the same services. And so that was better for everyone, or a positive. So kind of the insight about neighborhoods from this long historical record is that as cities evolved, neighborhoods were the building blocks of urban evolution through time. The cellular dynamic of urban change. It was neighborhood based. And then what happened is everything changed. With industrial urbanization, 19th century, this was the century of industrial urbanization. Cities started, neighborhoods were there, but things were starting to just get big behemoth in all kinds of different ways. And it was sort of the start of the decline of neighborhoods experienced in that more traditional sense. And basically, technological innovation lessened the need for a more local existence. And then what happened is, toward the end of the 19th century, you get all these sociologists, including the Chicago School sociologists and Ernest Burgess and Robert Park, freaking out about the loss of neighborhood. And they wanted to get the neighborhood back. And they really were concerned about this loss of neighborhood life. They were just very alarmed. They thought it was breaking apart the sense of belonging that the neighborhood, the village, the neighborhood had provided. And so they got together with urban planners, and they said, hey, urban planners, which was also a new field at the time, and they had these conferences with sociologists and urban planners. The sociologists said, hey, urban planners, how about designing neighborhoods? We need you to design neighborhoods that can be put back in so we're not having this industrial chaos. And so, do you guys know about this Chicago Club of Chicago? City Club of Chicago, you've probably heard of it. They had this design contest in 1912. Here's a quarter section of land, design a neighborhood. And every reigning architect in the world was in on this. It was Frank Lloyd Wright had several submissions. His was not a winning submission, and he was not happy about that. And I think this was like the third place winner. You can take this book out of the library, and these neighborhoods are like mosaic tiles. I mean, they're really quite beautiful. Then along comes, in the 1920s, you have another sociologist / urban planner, Clarence Perry, and he designs a neighborhood that really stuck, and it became wildly popular. And he had school at the center, major roads surrounding it. You did have a mix of single-family houses and apartments in there. You had little play lots. You had, all kinds of good stuff. This diagram has been picked apart and studied quite a bit. It's very famous in urban planning schools, as you know, right? And it really caught on, and it went all over the world. Here's a modernist architect, Le Corbusier, doing a plan of Chandigarh, India, based on the neighborhood unit. And lo and behold, the Urban Land Institute gets in the game, and they start pushing this neighborhood unit kind of ideal. And so here you have a situation where developers, as America is just sprawling out, they try to make it neighborhood-based, according to these designs, evolved out of the early 20th century, but it starts to just morph into all kinds of weird stuff. And so here's this was claimed to be a neighborhood unit, but this is high-rises around a golf course. But this is, pushed as a neighborhood unit model. So before too long, you basically have any kind of development being marketed as a neighborhood. So we haven't really progressed from there too well. And now I'm just going to run through a couple of things that are a problem for when urban planners try to design neighborhoods and try to create neighborhoods. What are some of the things that are getting in the way of that? One is about boundaries, and this is a book called Neighborhood Boundaries from 1960. And this is interesting because this is actually Stony Island Avenue on the south side of Chicago. And what they're saying here is, okay, look, you have these areas of single family over there on the right, you have black and white areas, you have apartments. That dark area in the middle with the commercial, that is a boundary, but we want it to not be a boundary. We want it to be a scene. It's a social scene that's going to bring these neighborhoods on either side together and create one neighborhood. And so that was a whole book worth of discussion about the concept of boundaries and what to do with them. If you've been on Stony Island Avenue recently, you will realize that there's no way that that functions like a social scene. It's a highway. So that doesn't work too well. Another thing that was talked about quite a bit, what's the appropriate scale of a neighborhood? So I love this image of this immigrant neighborhood gathering in Chicago in the 1920s. Can you just imagine what was being talked about there? This is from a book, a 1920 book called America Via the Neighborhood. And I do feel like in the early 20th century, there was just a lot more interest in creating neighborhood, and we got to get it back, and the industrial city is ruining us. Then sprawl comes along, and all that post-World War II spread that's supposedly neighborhood-based. Meanwhile, the rest of the city is losing its sense of neighborhood. Anyway, what is the right scale for neighborhood? Clarence Perry, with his neighborhood unit that I showed you, said 5,000 people. That's what you need. But that was based on what population was needed for that elementary school. So that has been blown all apart. There's neighborhood-based schools. That's pretty hard to hang on to. Then there's also the problem. I'm just stepping through the problems here. There are people like the IAF, that's Saul Alinsky, saying neighborhood is not a good thing for us because we are trying to fight capitalism via a much broader, workers united, collaborative that is not localized. And the more you're getting localized like a neighborhood, that actually undermines our political base and our political power. So there's a whole bunch of writing, and maybe this is more in the academic world exclusively, but anti-neighborhood. This is not what we need. We need to get much bigger about what we're doing. Then there was the whole thing with one of the critiques of neighborhood is the social determinism going on, and that's really has to do with what Clarence Perry was writing about, because the idea started to be, if you were a good neighborhood citizen, you would be a better person, and you need to, and this is from the Museum of Modern Art. This is a panel from the 1940s. They did this whole spread on neighborhood, kind of looks like that golf course-based neighborhood. These panels went all to art museums all over the country, and people were looking at these. And the message here is, be a good neighborhood citizen, you will be a better citizen, you will all get along, you will all be happy. And I mean, it's just really top-down and kind of creepy. And neighborhood got all wrapped up in that. And then even creepier was writing by Eliel Saarinen, who wrote this book called The City in the 1940s. And he's saying, if you're not neighborhood-based, like on the right there, then you're diseased. Like on the right is healthy urban tissue, and on the left is starting to be diseased. So that became pretty problematic. And then it starts to translate to this public housing projects. And this is actually one of the very first public housing projects, this one in Cleveland, and that was neighborhood-based, meaning that when they thought about how to develop public housing, they said, we're going to take Clarence Perry's neighborhood model, and we're going to plan it accordingly. So then pretty soon, you are creating a neighborhood that's very insular, That's its own unit, and not very well socially connected at all, especially not. So it's a problem of neighborhood being part of the problem of social segregation, neighborhood enabling social segregation. And that's been an enduring problem. And of course now we have developers out there creating these supposed neighborhoods, and it's really just housing that's all one price point. So we're back to the neighborhood as social homogeneity. So this is my last slide, and I'll just close by saying that for each of these issues that I've identified, I think our current situation signals that we need more and not less attention to defining neighborhoods. I wouldn't run away from what is your neighborhood and where is it. I would get more into it. And especially in this, during the pandemic, I thought that it was one positive out of the pandemic was people did start to become more aware of their local surroundings because they were constrained, and they became kind of hyper-aware. And in some places, they started to say, hey, where are my services? Where's the center to this neighborhood? How do I connect with people? And that started to be kind of forced into it. And that seemed like a good thing. So I hold out hope that the neighborhood in a more traditional sense of localized experience of, and having some kind of collective voice. And it's more than a segregator, and it's more than just an intersection where people are constantly asking each other, what neighborhood are you in? And they say, and it's really just to be able to locate on the map in their head, oh, you're at that, CTA stop or something. Giving neighborhoods more relevance, I think, is part of our goal with our research that we're doing. Ultimately, that's our goal. Of course, first, we're just researchers. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions.
I have several comments. First of all, I think if you had enough information, you could do a longitudinal study through time of how important people thought neighborhood names were and their use. I think it's gone up and down over time. For example, I grew up in West Ridge, and I didn't know that there were even community areas. I didn't know the name until I saw the map when I worked for Census 2000. And there's this community area map. I'd never heard of it before. And when I grew up, no one ever told me what neighborhood I lived in. There are 3 co-ops that still exist, and that's the closest thing to a neighborhood. It's on the map now, but it's on the same level as something like Green, food-related developments. Anyway, eventually I collected 3 printed maps of, the informal Chicago neighborhoods. And I understand that that's fine. They're informal, they change over time, they differ from one person to another. And eventually I asked the source of one of these maps how it was derived. And I was told, and I decided I really had a problem with all these informal neighborhood maps. Number one, because they weren't scientifically derived in the spatial sense. There was no regular grid used to obtain respondents saying, what neighborhood is this? And number 2, there was no investigation of the respondents who said, what neighborhood is this, as far as their level of information about the names and the history. For example, you can find a lot of people who don't even know there are community areas. They don't know the history of the name of the community area they're in. Heck, you've got politicians up at the top in Chicago who talk about 77 neighborhoods. And I tell them the only thing Chicago has 77 of is community areas. Powells don't even know this.
Good for you.
So,
I think you are right. That is a real pet peeve of mine.
I think
regular confusion between community areas and neighborhoods.
I think it's great, to make a neighborhood map, but it has to be done scientifically. I'm not aware that it was has ever been done scientifically for Chicago. As for the community areas and the science behind it, I don't know, I don't think that just because we don't know all the science behind it and think that maybe a lot of it was inside people's heads, doesn't mean that it wasn't done scientifically. One great advantage of the community areas is that they're compact, unlike the wards. There's no gerrymandering, there's two that seem kind of linear, but I want to know what is the reason for that before criticizing it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for those comments.
They were put together using what are called physical and perceptual barriers and homogeneity. They did the interviews to determine how nice they understood. But the boundaries, for instance, Edgewater, North Lakeview Township, went all the way to Western Avenue. Well, in what, 1908-10, they elevated the tracks on a berm, and it became a physical barrier. And we lost all those people who thought they lived, quote unquote, in Edgewater.
Yeah, I mean, they did put a lot of weight in barriers, the rivers, for example, the train tracks, but that has so changed. You know, not the rivers, but the tracks have come down, the highways have been put in, we got new barriers all over the place. So that's one reason to maybe revisit community areas, yes.
Okay, so I think you need to keep the community areas.
Sure.
Because you can compare demographic information at various points in time. And you've done that. You may want to change some of the names. Don't change Edgewater. It's fought very hard.
We'll come, and you know where you live, we'll come and get you.
Okay. And the other thing is, I don't know if you can ever scientifically determine this, because if it's a perception of people, you know, that will change over time. And just consider Edgewater, which we know a lot about, of course.
Yeah.
1950. Neighborhoods, I would say it's parishes and nothing else. So particularly St. Gertrude's, St. Gregory, St. Edith's. And then later, neighborhood organizations and block clubs emerged. And they created neighborhoods, you know, the names of them. Like Edgewater Glen, you know, basically single-family area, north of here. And so there was always a sense of neighborhood that didn't necessarily have the name they have today, like Edgewater Glen. And same with Lakeview Balboa. Some of the other areas weren't as defined because they weren't, single-family homes weren't predominant. But then because of the organizing efforts, there was a name somewhere, West Andersonville. Andersonville is interesting too. It started out pretty late, really, in terms of a name for the country, 1964. And then the neighborhood organization east of it was formed. I was involved in that, and it chose the name East Andersonville. And then when the one west of Clark Street was formed, it was West Andersonville. And there was a South Andersonville, south of Foster. So now Andersonville has, and then one of the things became very prominent. And so before we fought to be differentiated from Rogers Pond and Alcott, and now the competition is Andersonville in terms of perception. But part of it is also real estate.
Oh, yeah, the real
That's
estate
real
is
estate.
this, sure.
Certainly from the very beginning, and Cochran, the founder of Edgewater, named Edgewater.
Yeah.
And so, but even today, I mean, like Andersonville, you know, it's a good cachet, and so the boundaries are way
Creeping up to Broadway.
what people think.
You know, in our survey, we also asked people to give names and to name the neighborhood that they draw.
Yeah.
And so it'll be very interesting to analyze that.
Yeah.
To what degree are they just adopting the community areas or entering their own names?
Oh,
And how
very
much
interesting. Has any
agreement is
research
there?
been done for Edgewater?
Yeah, I'll let you know.
I didn't know anything about it. I don't think a number of us knew anything
Well,
about the
are you
survey.
guys, you're not getting bombarded with Google ads.
I mean, I'm subscribed to Block Club Chicago, Well, it's all,
Yeah.
inside goes, and anyone else.
Yes, sir.
Next time.
Could you please talk a little bit about the effect of high rises? Do they create micro neighborhoods? Do they enhance neighborhoods? Or do they fracture neighborhoods? Or something I didn't say?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, they can be, depends what kind of high rise. If it's a high rise, it could be very insular. If it's just not integrated with the rest of the neighborhood, it doesn't meet the street, the door isn't fronting the street. You have high rises that are just sitting in parks, and those tend to be pretty insular. And is that considered a neighborhood? I don't know. That's up for debate. Maybe a condo association. I don't know. I have a hard time thinking about that as a neighborhood, as a collective voice, because that isn't really concerned. What we're trying to have neighborhoods be about is the public realm and public spaces where people come together. So thinking of a neighborhood as a high rise as one neighborhood doesn't really meet that goal. So there's the reality of what we have, and then there's the aspiration of what we wish we have. So that's what you can. Whoa, everybody's hands up.
Real quickly, the official map that was created, was that formally adopted by any governmental body, or?
No, I'm really glad you raised that, because it was not.
Okay.
And if you go, so currently what we have are those 228 neighborhoods. If you go to Chicago, City of Chicago, they will say, and you can download, the map, and they will say, these are neighborhoods that we have, but they don't mean anything to us. We don't plan and function in them. There's nothing official
But the
about them.
community area map, so that never got any kind of official governmental blessing, correct?
Not the way the community
And is
areas.
it used for any kind of, governmental function, like, government aid distribution?
The neighborhood map?
The
Are you talking about the community areas?
Oh, the data.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, the community areas are
Yeah.
official.
Okay.
Yeah, they're official. I thought you were talking
No,
about the
no,
228.
by decree of like the city council, or was it formally adopted?
Yeah, I think back then, and they do planning work via the community areas, and the census data actually doesn't line up that well, but,
So like community development block grant distribution and things like that
All
is
that's-
still used for that. so-
Sorry, yeah, they're official.
And if we had changed any of that, then that might, like to Leroy's point, we would lose some sense of continuity if the community area maps were to be changed. So.
Yeah, then your data has to be broken up into before changes and after changes.
Well, nobody's talking about changing those.
Okay.
But the neighborhoods, different.
Yeah.
Much smaller. Those community areas are huge.
Right.
Some of them are 60,000 people.
We have 15
Like
block
us.
clubs in Edgewater, and they were very intentionally created back in the 1960s to help kind of reverse urban decline that was already starting to occur.
Uh-huh.
I would say we might be the shining star of achievement in that area.
Well, why don't the wards line up with the community areas?
Because they're gerrymandered.
I know, but I'm just saying.
Actually,
In a perfect world.
Edgewater's probably
Yours is
pretty
pretty
close
good.
to
The
us.
48 is pretty good.
Oh, okay.
What was the original Jerry?
And over the years, it's moved to be concurrent with it, the Edgewater boundaries.
Oh, nice.
More so
Okay.
than the rest of the-
That's cool.
I
But
spent.
that's 77 and
Okay,
50.
thank you, okay, thanks, okay, Jack, my turn. Quick question, so we actually live in what we call a vertical neighborhood, our vertical village.
Okay.
We're in the Malibu East.
Oh, yeah.
So there are so many activities, I mean, there's a Cuatro de Mayo party tonight, there's so much that goes on, and I used to live, actually across the street from Jack, on the west side of Broadway, where it was mostly single-family homes and that sort of thing, so and we couldn't figure out for the life of us why we couldn't get ASCO, which is the Association of Sheridan Road Condominium Owners. So that's the association, that's the block, that's
Okay.
not really the block, well, it is a block. So it represents 6,000 residents though. So we were trying to figure out why we couldn't get Malibu East and Tierra, all those folks to come out of cross Sheridan, not just to go to Dominic's or Whole Foods, but to go to activities. But then when I moved into Malibu, I saw that it's all there. We're our own precinct. You don't even have to leave the building to vote. So, so when you said that about you want neighborhoods to look, does the high rise face the street and can other people come in? Is it in a park? Is it, I thought that was very interesting. Which leads to my question, and I work for the Department of Employment Security, so I'm in the Economic Information and Analysis Division, so we could really use, I would love to talk to you later. And yes, 77 neighborhood, community areas, that's what we use. But my question is, how are you going to use this data going forward? I would love to know.
Well, we're going to write a bunch of research papers.
Okay.
Because publish or perish down there. And then we're hoping to present to the city. We have pretty good relations with the city. And, Chicago actually is kind of behind the times with activating neighborhoods. Other cities, neighborhoods have collective voice and, they have a more official means of governing themselves and doing their own planning work. And, I find Chicago behind the ball. Seattle, for example, they even had a program where they said, hey, neighborhoods, we need to densify, and people are always fighting more density, right? They said, hey, neighborhood, if you take on more affordable housing in your neighborhood, here's more money for a park, and here's money to do good things you want to do, like a carrot approach, not a stick. And so cities being more involved in activating neighborhoods and not, I did a study of looking at where, outside of this work, I had students go out and interview neighborhood associations to find out what they do. And what they do are garden walks and they fight development. And that seemed to be like the main thing. So where's the kind of proactive, have a vision of where you're going idea for your neighborhood? To do that kind of stuff, you need to have a more, a collective voice that the city recognizes and will pay attention to. So, yes, sir.
Hi. So, in response to urban decay in this neighborhood, in 1980, a very heavy footprint of subsidized housing was created on Balmoral and Kenmore. And I've lived in the neighborhood for 33 years. And what I've recognized over time is that, one, people living in subsidized housing will not criticize management because they're afraid of losing their leases. So the neighborhood's completely dependent on the attitude of the management company for the maintenance of the properties and the public area, like parkways. The heavy footprint I referenced, they haven't done any landscaping in 13 years. Mud on the parkways. So I think that's a critical point. Neighborhoods are affected by absentee landlords. And in this case, in Edgewater, it's a very heavy footprint.
You have a lot of absentee landlords?
Well, that has 22 buildings, 22 mid-rise buildings and high-rise buildings. The landlord's not, there's a management person in one of the buildings. They're not walking around looking at the property. It's essentially an absentee landlord. Nobody's living there that's concerned about the quality of the space. It's about profit and loss.
Yeah. Well, this is the kind of thing that in this aspiration of a collective neighborhood that has a good identity and a sense of itself and has some ability to work together about the place and form a plan and form a vision and have the regulatory part of it too. We didn't talk about zoning, but that's a whole thing. And come up with a plan for what to do about that particular problem. If you wanted to do something about that as a group, how would you do it?
I call HUD and I call the Illinois Housing Authority.
Okay.
And once in a while they step in, and I have a relationship with the senior VP of that division of that management company. But
you shouldn't be working individually on that.
So far I've had the best results working individually.
We're nearly out of time here for the press, so maybe one last question.
I was just gonna say, I took your survey,
Oh, good, thank
And I
you.
thought, wow, this is pretty easy. I know my neighborhood, it's practically linear, it's got some nice boundaries. And that's a survey? Well, there's more to it? Well, it's even too simple, but now after you talk to that, most people have no idea. And ours is a well-defined, we've done a lot of research and work at making our community knowledgeable so everyone knows where Edgewater is. Even though now Andersonville is so powerful, it's like usurping the word Edgewater, but commercially it's so powerful. But I just thought, wow, that's a pretty easy survey.
Great, well, thank you.
One real last clip she was trying to get.
Seriously, this is a general question and it's about strategies. So within neighborhoods or communities, there's competing interests. And you want to shift people to think about shared interests. What strategies will help as we try as community members to try to better our neighborhoods, our communities? What strategy along that continuum of competing interests and shared interests, what strategy helps?
Well, you have to have something positive that you're working together on. Like, here's a vacant lot, we need to repurpose it, let's all work collectively to make that happen. Do you have community-based budgeting here? That's another really
Participatory.
kind of sort. That's another thing where Chicago is behind the ball on that. That's a really good way to activate neighborhoods to do something positive, work together on something positive.
We recently had a historic tree survey that the Historical Society sponsored, where people throughout the community in their neighborhoods went out to measure and document trees, and so it had
Okay.
something to work. You know, trees that have
That's
been there for
positive.
50 to 100
2,300 mature trees in Edgewater.
Oh, nice.
Through the
But
survey.
it's,
You're
you're right.
right.
And we're
Diseases.
fighting to keep them because the city cuts them down willy-nilly.
Oh, my gosh.
So,
But it's an example of a positive project,
Yes.
common project
Yeah.
across people.
Yeah. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.